The fire was low, but steady, casting dancing shadows on the timbered walls of the longhouse. Outside, the world was wrapped in darkness, the kind that only came in the far north when the sun gave itself fully to the night. People from Viking times had the deepest sleep throughout history, and on nights like this, it was easy to understand why. The structure of their lives, guided by the rhythm of the seasons and shaped by the demands of nature, invited rest. When the day's work ended, there were no clocks, no screens, no hum of distant highways. Just the soft murmur of wind through the trees and the low crackle of firewood. Inside, families gathered, not in frantic conversation, but in shared silence. A Viking child curled beneath a woolen blanket, while his mother tucked the edges close to his shoulders. She hummed a tune passed down from mothers before her, a sound older than memory. The thick, insulated walls and heavy roof kept the warmth in and the noise out. One reason people from Viking times had the deepest sleep throughout history was their connection to natural rhythms. They rose with the light and slept with the dark. No artificial light extended their waking hours. No urgent obligations followed them into their dreams. Their sleep was earned through physical labor, untroubled by the modern anxieties that twist rest into restlessness. A man placed his tools down with care, the metal clinking softly as he slid them into a carved wooden chest. The air smelled of pine smoke, wool, and the faint tang of iron. Nearby, his wife added more moss to the bedding, thick and soft like forest loam. Their children's breaths deepened. People from Viking times had the deepest sleep throughout history, not by chance, but by design. Their homes were made for silence. Their food was hearty and filling, their labor purposeful and satisfying. They held fewer distractions, fewer worries about things they could not control. What they feared, storms, wolves, enemies, were tangible, not imagined. By the hearth, an elder recited a short blessing, not to ward off bad dreams, but to honor the simple gift of night. Outside, the northern wind howled past the mountains. But inside, warmth and stillness reigned. There were no alarms to set, no schedules to follow, only the long, undisturbed stretch of sleep. In conclusion, the Viking people experienced a quality of rest to modern life, struggles to recapture. Rooted in a life of natural harmony, free from constant stimulation and saturated noise, their sleep was a full surrender to night. People from Viking times had the deepest sleep throughout history because their world allowed them to rest not just their bodies, but their minds. And in that rest, they found peace. The longhouse glowed with amber light as dusk deepened into night. The fire had been tended carefully, and the smoke rose steadily through the smoke hole in the roof, curling toward the stars. The warmth held inside the home was precious. Every ember mattered. A Viking man stood near the entrance, setting aside a wooden bowl he had just washed. The water had been cold, drawn from the well before dark, and his hands still tingled from the chill. He dried them on a cloth his Viking wife had woven months ago. The scent of birch lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the low hum of the fire. His axe, newly sharpened, hung on a wooden peg by the door, not out of fear, but tradition. No harm was expected tonight. Still, the tools of survival remained close. The world outside could be unpredictable, but inside, this place was theirs. The Viking woman moved quietly around the fire, laying out extra furs over the straw mats. The Viking children had already begun to drift off, their limbs heavy and still. One of them let out a soft sigh as she tucked the cover to his chin. She smiled, then placed another log into the fire with practiced care. Her fingers were rough from work, but gentle. The flames flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that danced with every movement. No one spoke. There was no need. The language of this hour was silence, breath, and warmth. The Viking man sat down beside the hearth, crossing his legs beneath him. His wife joined him, and together they watched the fire settle. It snapped once, throwing a spark into the air. Outside, the wind pressed against the wall in gentle bursts, like a lullaby only the village could hear. The Viking children shifted beneath their furs, closer to one another, finding comfort in the presence of family. Their bodies touched shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, a soft tangle of sleep and safety. The air had grown colder, but no one noticed. The fire's glow made the room feel like a different world, removed from time. Sleep wasn't commanded. It arrived in stillness. The Viking man reached for his wife's hand. She gave it without looking. He squeezed it gently. Their work was done. The animals were fed, the tools cleaned, the children quiet. Outside, the gods watched from behind the stars, and inside nothing stirred. No one feared the dark. It had never been their enemy. It was the space where dreams lived, where old stories returned, where breath became rhythm and rhythm became rest. The fire flickered low again. No one moved. The house breathed, and with it, so did they. Sleep was here. The moon had climbed high into the night sky, casting a pale silver light through the smoke hole above the longhouse. Its glow mixed with the flickering of the fire, creating a quiet rhythm of light and shadow that moved across the walls and the sleeping faces within. The embers pulsed, soft and red, like the final breath of the day. A Viking woman lay on her side near the hearth, wrapped tightly in a thick fur cloak lined with foxes. Her fingers were curled gently beneath her cheek. Her breathing was slow and even, rising and falling with the steady tempo of true rest. Around her, the Viking family lay close, shoulders pressed, knees brushing, warmth shared. The floor beneath them was layered with straw and soft woven mats. It was not comfortable, as the wealthy might have known it, but it was comfortable enough. Here, sleep did not require luxury. It required only stillness, shelter, and the nearness of those you trusted. Rain began to fall outside, light at first, then heavier. It pattered against the thatch roof, each drop finding its rhythm like fingers tapping gently on the world. No one stirred. The sound was familiar, and it did not disturb. It was soothing. One of the Viking children, a young girl barely more than 5 winters old, shifted in her sleep. Her hand reached for her mother's arm, finding it without effort. The woman didn't wake. She simply turned slightly, making space, and the girl nestled in closer. Her small body trembled once, then settled. Her dreams resumed. The fire popped softly. A spark jumped and then died. The warmth it gave off wrapped around the sleepers like another layer of furs. It reached into the corners of the longhouse and touched the wooden beams, the old tapestries, the hand-carved bowls on the shelves. In this hour, the world was as it should be, simple, sacred, quiet. There were no clocks to race, no sounds of distant roads or machines, only breath and heartbeat, rain and fire. Dreams came not as escape, but as welcome companions. Some dreamed of rivers and mountains, others dreamed of ancestors, of long-gone faces and voices that still echoed somewhere in memory. And some dreamed of nothing at all, just peace. Outside, the trees swayed under the soft weight of rain. Somewhere on the edge of the forest, a fox curled tighter beneath a hollow log. Farther still, the river ran beneath the moon, endless and sure. But inside the longhouse, the world had narrowed to a single room, a single moment where every soul slept as if the gods themselves had laid their hands upon them and whispered, "Be still." Sleep was not taken, it was given. Not all within the longhouse were asleep. One Viking man sat near the doorway, his back against the thick timber frame, his gaze turned toward the dark beyond the entrance. He was not restless. He was chosen. It was his turn to keep watch, not because he feared the night, but because tradition asked for it. Each family took turns standing guard, not to fight, but to listen, to be awake when the world slept, was to honor both the land and the people within. His hands rested on his knees, open and calm. He could hear everything: the soft breath of his kin, the fading crackle of the hearth, the quiet stretch of old wood beneath the roof. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the wind moved gently through the trees. He didn't hear danger. He heard peace. That, too, was something worth noticing. The dog beside him lifted its head briefly, ears twitching at some distant sound only it could hear. Then it lowered its snout again and sighed. The man reached out and laid a hand on its back, steady and silent. No words were exchanged, but understanding passed between them. The night was holding. He shifted slightly and pulled the fur tighter around his shoulders. It was not the cold that unsettled a Viking watcher, it was the stillness. But tonight, that stillness was kind. It crept into his chest like smoke, warming the spaces between his ribs. His eyelids grew heavy, but he did not close them. He had made a promise. Behind him, a child whimpered faintly in her sleep. Her mother stirred and placed a calming hand over the child's side. There was no panic, no fear, just movement born of love, even in dreams. The child settled. The mother's breathing returned to rhythm. The fire dimmed further, reduced now to glowing coals. A soft Viking light lingered, like the final heartbeat of the day, a warmth older than memory, part of what made their sleep so deep. The watcher turned his head slightly and looked around the room. All was as it should be. He thought of his own childhood, of his father, sitting just where he was now, eyes fixed on the dark, protecting nothing and everything at once. He remembered the way his father had looked back at the sleeping family, the way he had smiled softly, as if the sight itself gave him rest. Now, it was his turn to guard the deepest Viking sleep, the kind passed down like stories by firelight. The wind whispered again through the trees, rustling leaves like soft voices in a distant hall. The man breathed it in and felt no fear. He belonged to this Viking night as much as the stars did. And when the time came to sleep, someone else would rise and take his place. That was the way of things. The dog shifted again. The man stroked its fur one last time, then returned to stillness. Outside, the forest waited. Inside, sleep endured. The fire had faded into a soft bed of embers, its glow dim but steady. It cast a faint red light across the floor, just enough to outline the shapes of sleeping bodies wrapped in furs. A gentle hush had fallen over the longhouse. It was not silence forced by exhaustion, but a silence that came with deep, earned rest. A Viking child stirred in her sleep, her hand twitching slightly as if reaching for something unseen. Her lips moved, but no words came. She was dreaming not of places she had known, but of lands told to her in stories. Her dreams were not filled with fear or confusion, but with forests filled with golden light, rivers that whispered her name, and the soft voice of her grandmother, long past, humming a melody she had never heard, but somehow remembered. Her Viking mother lay beside her, half awake, sensing the child's movement. She did not open her eyes, but reached out instinctively, placing a calming hand over her daughter's back. The child settled instantly, curling deeper into the blanket. The warmth of the room wrapped around them both like breaths held between prayers. The others slept deeply. One of the Viking men mumbled faintly in his dream, perhaps walking the shores of a place he had fished as a boy. An elderly woman let out a long sigh, not of frustration, but of surrender. Sleep here was not escape, it was return, a journey inward, a place where the past breathed just beneath the surface, and the soul could meet it without fear. The carvings above them, symbols etched into beams generations ago, caught the fire's last light. Spirals, runes, suns, and animals danced across the wood, reminders of those who came before and what they had left behind. They were not decorations, they were memories. And in sleep, memory became sacred again. Outside, the rain had stopped. Drops clung to the edges of the roof and fell slowly, one by one, to the ground. The trees dripped, the earth breathed, and even the wind had softened. The night had deepened, moving past its peak and into the quiet hours where time held no weight. A raven cried out in the distance, a single call. It echoed briefly through the valley, then faded. No one heard it, not truly. They were too far inside themselves, now wrapped in furs and dreams and the pulse of their own hearts. They would remember nothing of this hour, but it would live in their bones all the same. In this Viking house, on this land, under this sky, sleep reigned. It wasn't forced, it wasn't fleeting, it was whole. The fire breathed its final breath, the coals glowed faintly beneath the ash, and still no one moved. They had surrendered fully, and in that surrender they found peace. The wind had shifted during the night, carrying with it the scent of wet pine and earth from beyond the forest. Somewhere in the hills, a wolf howled once and was answered faintly in the distance. But the sound was far away, no closer than the moon, and within the longhouse no one stirred. The fire had died down to ash, but its warmth remained, trapped in the stones and in the air that clung to thick walls of timber and mud. A Viking woman lay on her back near the hearth, her arms folded over her chest. She wasn't awake, but her mind floated close to the surface of sleep. In her dream, she walked through snow barefoot, but not cold. The trees towered above her, quiet and silver with frost, and the stars flickered low in the sky, close enough to reach. She could feel her breath, calm and steady, a sense of knowing wrapped around her like a cloak. There was no fear, only stillness. A baby stirred beside her. His fists were balled tight near his face, and his brow furrowed, though he made no sound. He was too young for words, but not too young for dreams. His body, so small and soft, still knew the rhythm of the womb, of heartbeat and breath. He shifted slightly, and the Viking woman beside him turned just enough to lay her arm over him in sleep, drawing him closer. His breathing matched hers within moments. Across the room, another Viking family lay in a cluster, mother, father, 2 sons, pressed into the curve of each other's backs. The father twitched in his sleep, his foot dragging slightly against the straw. He had spent the day chopping wood, and the soreness lived in his muscles still. But now, the pain has softened. His body belonged to the night. In his mind, he was a boy again, fishing with his grandfather at the edge of the fjord, their legs dangling from a dock built long before either of them were born. The wooden beams of the longhouse creaked softly as the wind pushed gently against the walls. The noise was not alarming. It was expected, part of the song of the home itself, a place alive with breath and memory. In the loft above, an old woman slept with fur pulled tight around her shoulders. Her mouth moved slightly as she dreamed, her lips forming the names of people long gone. Her chest rose and fell like a wave, unhurried. Sleep had become a shared act, something passed from body to body like warmth in winter. No words had been spoken in hours, and none were needed. The house was full, not of sound, but of presence. A breath, a twitch, a heartbeat, all woven into the fabric of night. Outside, the wind hushed the world. Inside, sleep held everything. The night deepened. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the soft, slow kind that drifted rather than dropped, blanketing the village in white without a sound. No one saw it, no one needed to. The world already felt softer, quieter, the kind of quiet that seeped into bones and made even the restless still. The longhouse was wrapped in that hush, thick and sacred. In the far corner, an old Viking man lay on his side, his hand beneath his cheek, the lines on his face relaxed. He hadn't spoken much that day, he rarely did anymore, but in sleep he was more alive than anyone knew. His dreams were vivid, full of rivers he used to cross barefoot, hills he used to run down without thought. He dreamt of holding his daughter's hand when she was only 3 winters old, her laughter echoing through the trees. Near him, a Viking boy breathed deeply, his chest rising with the rhythm of peace. He had spent the afternoon helping his mother grind herbs and mix tallow for the winter balm. His arms ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that reminded him he was growing stronger. His dreams were simple, of carved animals that came to life and forests lit by golden light. He did not know their meaning, he didn't need to. The fire had gone almost silent, just a faint ember pulsing under a layer of ash. But the heat still lived in the stones, in the wool, in the bodies curled close together. A fur slipped from a child's shoulder, and her sister, half asleep, reached over to pull it back into place. She didn't open her eyes, she just knew. That was how sleep moved here, not alone, but shared, passed along like breath. A soft creak came from the roof beams as the wind shifted. The house sighed in reply. Someone coughed gently, not in illness but instinct, then returned to sleep. No one stirred fully. The quiet held. Outside, a fox padded through the snow between the homes, its paws barely making a mark. The trees whispered in the distance. Inside, the Viking people of the longhouse remained still. Time did not matter. There were no hours to measure, only the stretch of night and the promise of waking. And even that promise was distant. For now, the only truth was sleep, ancient, unbroken, deep. A soft groan of wood echoed from the wall as the wind changed direction again. The longhouse held firm, as it had for decades, the beams seasoned by countless winters. Inside, the cold never fully reached them. The warmth of fire, breath, and togetherness wove through the room like an invisible thread. A Viking mother rolled onto her side and pulled her infant closer, instinct guiding her more than thought. Her arm wrapped around the baby's small form, and her fingers rested lightly on the child's back. The infant's breathing, slow and shallow, seemed to be steady with the mother's cup. The night wrapped around them like wool, thick, soft, and total. Two Viking brothers lay nearby, the older's arm flung loosely over the younger's shoulders. They had quarrelled that afternoon, their voices rising briefly over a misplaced fishing hook, but that was forgotten now. Sleep had returned them to what they were, not opponents, but blood. They shared the same breath, the same warmth, and in sleep they shared the same peace. In the upper corner of the longhouse, perched between two beams, a raven feather had been tied to a string of bone and beads. It swayed slightly as the house shifted. It had been hung there many years ago, by hands long gone, to guard the room from spirits and sickness. Whether it worked or not, no one questioned it. It had always been there. In a place where sleep was sacred, even small rituals carried meaning. The scent of smoke still lingered. It clung to skin, hair, and blankets, not as a nuisance, but as a reminder. The fire was life. It had cooked their food, warmed their homes, boiled their medicines, and now it had helped usher them into slumber. What little light remained from the embers danced in soft glows across the wooden floor. A child laughed in her dream, not loudly, just a quick puff of breath and a shift of her hand, as if reaching for something. Her mother, still half asleep, smiled and let her fingers rest gently across the child's arm. No words were exchanged. There was no need. The language of sleep in this place was made of touch, breath, and closeness. Outside, the snow had grown thicker, the sky darker, but inside, nothing mattered except the stillness of this moment. No one planned, no one worried. Tomorrow would arrive on its own. The night held them now, and they gave themselves over without resistance. And so they lay side by side, cheek to fur, breath to breath, held not only by the blankets that covered them, but by the world that cradled them, a world that, for now, asked nothing but rest. This was Viking sleep, deep, still, and untouched by the worries of the waking world. The night had settled into its deepest hour. It was that silent, sacred time when even the wind paused to listen. Outside, the snow continued to fall, light and soundless, dusting the roof like a slow-moving breath. Inside the longhouse, nothing stirred. Even the fire had quieted to a faint, glowing heart. A Viking teenage boy lay near the wall, facing away from the hearth. His arms were tucked beneath his chest, and one leg bent awkwardly beneath the other. He didn't shift. His body had surrendered fully to sleep, muscles relaxed, jaw slack, breath even. Earlier that day, he had wrestled with his cousin in the snow. Their laughter echoed through the trees. Now, that energy had vanished, replaced by something deeper. Stillness. Warmth. Rest. His Viking mother lay close behind him, her body forming a gentle curve against his back. She had raised him with quiet strength, not with many words, but with the assurance of her presence. Even now, asleep, her nearness held him. She dreamed of waves vast and endless, and a boat without oars, drifting into the morning. The dream was silent, but in her chest it felt like singing. The fire had faded completely. No flame, only the occasional soft hiss of cooling ash and the smell of smoke still woven into the walls. It didn't matter. The heat trapped in the stones and bodies would last until sunrise. One by one, everyone had turned inward, their breath slowing to match the pace of the night itself. A Viking man lying across the room grunted in his sleep, the sound low and brief. His hand moved toward the side of his body, as if reaching for something. Perhaps he dreamed of a hunt, of chasing elk through the snow-covered valley, or maybe of something softer, a touch, a voice, a song heard long ago by the river. No one would ever know. Dreams in this place weren't shared aloud. They were kept, held like stones in a pouch, smooth from memory and time. One of the Viking children coughed twice, sharp and sudden, then went silent. His older sister turned in response, adjusting the blanket between them. Their hands touched briefly before stilling. Outside, the snow thickened, and a bird rustled beneath the eaves, feathers shaking before settling again. Even the animals knew this night was not meant to be disturbed. The walls of the Viking longhouse, stained dark with years of smoke and time, held the stories of hundreds of nights like this one. Nights of fire and cold, of silence and sleep, of closeness without words. And though no one would remember this particular evening, it would live in the body, in the breath, the dreams, the quiet peace of having simply rested well. The snow outside had thickened to a silent white wall, covering the land and muffling all sound. The world was smaller now, reduced to what could be felt: warmth, breath, the soft weight of fur blankets. Inside the longhouse, the night deepened, not with darkness, but with a kind of hush that pressed into every beam, every bone. A Viking man near the hearth shifted slightly. He had worked the forge that day, his hands still marked with soot and small burns. Even in sleep, his fingers curled as if still gripping a hammer. His legs twitched, a small, instinctive motion, but the rest of him remained still. His dreams were filled with heat, not of fire, but of sunlight on iron, the scent of smoke, the strength of something newly shaped. In his sleep, he smiled. His Viking wife lay beside him, the arch of her back rising gently with every breath. She had stitched torn clothing late into the evening, her fingers sore and stiff. But now, her hands rested over her stomach, completely still. Her face, lined from years of wind and sun, had softened. She dreamed of grass beneath her feet, and of her mother's voice, low and distant, singing from beyond the hills. A Viking child nearby had rolled onto her side. Her mouth moved slightly, a silent conversation with something in her dreams. Her Viking father reached out in the dark, his hand resting lightly on her back. She didn't wake, but her breathing slowed again, drawn into his. The fire had dimmed to barely a flicker beneath the ashes, but the warmth it left behind lingered like memory. The walls of the longhouse held it in, the logs swollen from years of smoke and winter. Everything smelled of wool, of pine resin, of old stories. And somewhere deeper in that scent was something even older, the smell of rest. One of the younger Viking boys let out a soft sound, not quite a word, and then returned to silence. The girl beside him, half asleep, pulled her cloak higher and adjusted the blanket between them. It was not comfort born from need, but from habit, the way Viking sleep was cared for, like a fragile flame passed from hand to hand. Above them, the carved rafters bore the shapes of stars, beasts, runes for strength and peace. They glowed faintly in the fire's final light, etched not just into the wood, but into memory. The dreams that lived beneath them were not loud. They didn't flash or startle. They moved like river mist, soft, slow, curling into the corners of the heart. The man exhaled in his sleep. His wife shifted closer. The child between them pressed her face into her mother's side. And in that closeness, nothing more was needed. No words, no light. Just the rhythm of breath and the certainty that on this night they were safe. The wind had softened. It no longer howled or pushed. It drifted, curling around the longhouse like a blanket placed gently over the Viking village. Snowflakes fell, one by one, silent and wide, disappearing into the whiteness that covered every rooftop and branch. Inside, the world was still. In the centre of the Viking longhouse, an older Viking couple lay back to back. They had grown used to this position, not out of habit, but harmony. Her breath matched his, slow and deliberate, as if their lungs had long ago agreed on a rhythm. She dreamt of the sea, endless and calm, a flat horizon stretching into forever. He dreamt of a bonfire, its smoke curling upward, where faces appeared and disappeared like memories he'd forgotten he still carried. Near them, one of the Viking children had turned over in sleep, his hand now resting against his uncle's arm. The Viking man did not move, but his body adjusted slightly, a subtle shift that made more space. The floor creaked softly beneath the movement, not with protest, but acknowledgement. The house was alive. It breathed with them, held them, remembered them. Faint scratches came from the other side of the room, a dog shifting near the door, licking its paws, then curling back into a ball. Its ears twitched with every sound outside, every breath of wind or rustle of branches, but nothing concerned it. The Viking village was quiet, the forest at peace. The fire had been reduced to the softest possible light, no flame, just glow. The ash pulsed now and then, like something breathing beneath the surface. Shadows no longer danced across the walls. They merely rested, leaning into corners, gathering behind pots and baskets, as if sleeping too. A Viking woman stirred beside her daughter and ran a hand through the girl's thick hair. The movement was small and unconscious. The child didn't wake, but she leaned into the touch. That moment, unremarkable in the light of day, became sacred in the darkness. A sign of care passed wordlessly from one body to another. The rafters above groaned once more. A few snowflakes drifted through the smoke hole and disappeared before reaching the ground. They melted in the warm air, lost before they were ever seen. But the cold they carried touched nothing. The heat from the Viking bodies, the breath, the layers of fur and wool, they held the line. And beneath that heat was something stronger still, belonging. The deepest sleep, warm and unshaken, belonged to them tonight. No one feared what might come in the morning. The forest would wake again, the animals would stir, the snow would melt. But that was not tonight's concern. Tonight asked for nothing but stillness. And the Viking longhouse, wrapped in that silence, gave itself fully to the dark. A single snowflake drifted in through the smoke hole and vanished before touching the ground. The air inside the longhouse remained warm, heavy with the scent of smoke, pine, and wool. Every part of the home seemed to rest on the floor. The rafters, the bowls on their shelves, even the walls, thick with age and memory, stood in stillness. Near the back of the Viking longhouse, a young Viking woman slept with her arms stretched above her head, her fingers resting on a rolled-up tunic she used as a pillow. Her breath moved through parted lips, slow and even. Earlier, she had braided her sister's hair by the fire, humming softly as the girl fidgeted and squirmed. Now, she lay still, the same song looping in her dream, but this time carried by the wind. Her sister slept beside her, arms curled to her chest, her legs tangled in the furs. She twitched slightly, as if reacting to something in the dream, perhaps a chase, a game, or a memory she didn't fully understand. She didn't wake, her body stilled again almost instantly. A Viking man snored softly a few feet away. His chest rose and fell with slow confidence, like the tides. He had hunted that day, and though he had returned without meat, there had been no shame. The land provided when it was ready. That night, he dreamed not of failure, but of trees stretching endlessly above him, their branches covered in frost, their silence deep and ancient. The embers let out a soft hiss, and one last curl of smoke lifted before fading. The fire had done its work. Warmth remained in the stones around the hearth, radiating into the sleeping forms nearby. A fur slipped from a Viking child's leg, but her brother, still half asleep, reached across and pulled it back into place without opening his eyes. These were gestures learned without teaching. No one needed to be told how to love here. They simply did. Above them, the smoke hole framed a patch of sky where stars shimmered faintly. Clouds moved slowly, like sails drifting across a sea of black. The moon was hidden, but its light pushed through the clouds just enough to outline the snow-laden trees beyond the Viking village. In the silence, a breath, then another, and another. Not loud, not hurried. The sound of people safe in their home, wrapped in warmth, in memory, in rest. The dog by the door lifted its head once more, blinked, and lowered it again. Its ears twitched. The snow fell gently now, a little slower, a little softer, as if even the storm had chosen to sleep. Inside the Viking longhouse, time didn't matter. The night could last forever, and no one would mind. Sleep had settled over them all, like a second skin. They did not dream of waking, not yet. The wind outside had stilled completely. Snow clung to every surface branch, rooftops, the sides of the Viking longhouse, turning the village into a quiet world of white and shadow. The moon hung low behind a veil of cloud, its light soft and diffused. The forest slept, and so did everything within it. Inside the longhouse, the air had cooled, but the warmth of bodies and thick furs held steady. A Viking woman near the hearth shifted slightly, her hand reaching out in sleep to touch her husband's arm. She found it, and her body relaxed again. She didn't wake, didn't speak. Her hand stayed there, a quiet promise in the dark. A Viking child whimpered nearby. It was not the sound of fear, but of a dream turning. The old Viking man beside her opened one eye, just barely. His body remained still, but he listened. When the child let out another soft cry, he slid his arm over her without a word. His hand rested on her shoulder, and slowly her breathing returned to rhythm. He closed his eyes again. These moments passed unnoticed by the rest of the house. No one else stirred. The Viking dreams that filled the room moved slowly, like fog creeping over a lake. There were no harsh movements, no sharp sounds, only warmth and weight and breath. The dog, loyal to his Viking family, lifted its head once more, sniffed the air, then rested it on its paws. Its ears twitched once, then stilled. The world outside remained unchanged. There were no threats here, only snow and the quiet pulse of winter. The fire, nearly gone, gave off no more light, but the heat it had left behind soaked into the floor and the wool. In this way, warmth lived longer than flame. One of the older Viking boys lay near the wall, his legs tangled in a fur, a hand resting palm up on his chest. He dreamed of fields in summer, of a river too wide to cross, of his father laughing. His body didn't move, but his face softened, lips parting slightly as if to speak to someone only he could see. His Viking brother beside him shifted. and muttered something too quiet to hear. Then silence again. In the rafters, a spider moved slowly along its thread. It was the only creature awake, its tiny body swaying with the occasional draft that passed through the cracks in the roof. It too seemed in no hurry, and the house breathed on. Not loudly, not urgently, but fully. The kind of breath taken when nothing is needed, when nothing is feared. Sleep had not just visited this Viking home. It had claimed it, wrapped it in silence and shadow, and made it its own. And in the stillness, every heart, young and old, beat in time with the night. The night had reached its quietest moment, that thin line between dark and deeper dark, when even the stars seemed to hold their breath. Snow had stopped falling, and a soft mist had settled over the trees. The world outside looked frozen, not in fear, but in peace. Inside the longhouse, nothing moved. The fire was long gone, reduced to dust and faint heat clinging to stone. The room was warm, not from flame, but from the weight of sleep. It hung thick in the air like smoke used to, seeping into wool, wood and skin. A Viking father and his young son lay side by side. The boy had crawled into his father's arms sometime after midnight, needing nothing but closeness. His father, without waking, had made space for him, his arm wrapping instinctively around the child's body. The boy's face pressed into his father's chest, breathing in a scent of ash and leather and safety. In sleep, the Viking man dreamed of standing in a meadow beneath the full moon. He heard no sounds, but he felt everything: the softness of grass underfoot, the tug of wind at his hair, the steady thump of his heart in the center of his chest. He hadn't known he missed that feeling until the dream gave it back. Nearby, a Viking mother and daughter shared a fur blanket. The girl had turned toward her mother in sleep, her fingers curled into the hem of her mother's sleeve. Her breath came in little bursts, then settled. Her mother, eyes closed, shifted just enough to rest her forehead against her daughter's. She hadn't meant to. Her body had simply done what it knew. The room had taken on a hum, not from noise, but from presence. So many Viking bodies, so many dreams, resting together like stones in a stream bed. They did not speak. They did not need to. They had done this before, and they would do it again, season after season, storm after storm. Above, in the rafters, a thread of smoke from hours earlier still clung faintly to the air. It carried with it memory of stew boiled, of fire tended, of laughter that had once echoed between the beams. These things lingered, even after sound was gone. A gust of wind nudged the wall, but no one inside noticed. The logs creaked, settled, returned to stillness. The dog near the entrance snored lightly, its body twitching once before falling still again. The village remained untouched, the forest undisturbed. In this hour, there was no tomorrow, there was no yesterday. There was only this deep, sacred moment of perfect stillness, no thoughts, no fear. Only warmth, breath, and the soft thrum of dreams shared between Viking families lying close in the dark. Sleep, here, was not survival. It belonged. A soft groan echoed from the beams above as the weight of snow shifted slightly on the roof. The sound was low and distant, like a giant sigh from the house itself. It had heard the wind, held back the cold, and kept its people warm for yet another night. A Viking man near the doorway stirred just enough to adjust the fur over his legs. He didn't wake. His breath continued in slow rhythm. Earlier that day, he had mended the fence near the goat pen, his hands red from the cold, his back aching. But those sensations were long gone. In his dream, he was gliding across water in a boat with no oars. It moved without effort. The fjord around him sparkled in the sunday. The air was warm, and there was no destination, only peace. A Viking woman slept with her hand resting on her husband's arm. Her fingers twitched slightly now and then, as if her dream was shaping something. Perhaps she was weaving again, or tending to herbs in the sunday. The room around her did not exist in that world, only texture, scent, and memory. Her face was calm, lined from years but soft in sleep. Two Viking boys lay beside one another, limbs tangled under a shared blanket. One had kicked it down in his dream, but the other had pulled it back over them without opening his eyes. Their bond didn't need speech. It was formed in firewood, carried together, berries picked in the forest, and meals shared in silence. It carried over into sleep like everything else. The house no longer glowed. There was no light left, not from fire, not from the moon, only the shape of warmth. A stillness that didn't feel empty but full, as if the very air was holding them. A bowl near the hearth tipped slightly from the shifting of the floor beneath it, then settled again. The contents inside dried flowers, a stone, and a feather didn't spill. They had been left there as an offering earlier in the evening. A small Viking tradition kept without fail, not for worship, but for remembrance. A habit passed from mothers to daughters, and now done without question. A dog let out a low groan in its sleep, paws twitching against the floor. Perhaps it chased a deer in its dreams or ran through snow without end. It did not wake. None of them did. The wind outside had quieted entirely. The trees stood still. Even the snow, so eager before, had stopped falling. And yet the night did not feel empty. It was full of breath, of presence, of hearts beating beneath blankets and skin. The Viking longhouse breathed with them, the night held them, and sleep did not simply rest on their bodies, it lived there. This is not borrowed sleep. It was earned deep, ancestral, and undisturbed. The coals had cooled, leaving behind a bed of grey ash that glowed only faintly in places, like the memory of a fire. No one had stirred in hours. The longhouse was still. Not the brittle stillness of fear, but the soft, breathing stillness of deep sleep. Near the centre of the room, a Viking woman shifted slightly. Her body curved protectively around her infant, who lay swaddled against her chest. The baby's tiny hand had slipped out from the cloth, fingers opening and closing in rhythm with some dream no one could name. The woman did not wake. Her arms adjusted just enough to pull the child closer, and her breath steadied again. A young Viking boy across the room stretched in his sleep, letting out a long sigh as one leg extended from beneath the fur. The cold kissed his skin, but he didn't move to cover it. His body trusted the warmth of the house, the presence of others, the silence that wrapped everything. He had fallen asleep, thinking about a story his uncle told, of a bear that lived deep in the hills, too big to see, too old to die. In his dream, he followed its tracks through the snow, not in fear, but in wonder. The rafters above held the weight of the night like a secret. Their carved edges were nearly invisible now, cloaked in shadow, but still there were ancient symbols of strength, of peace, of the gods who watched but never interfered. A raven's feather hung from one beam, swaying only slightly when the wind crept through a crack in the wall. A girl near the wall had turned onto her back, her hand now resting against her older sister's arm. Their legs touched beneath the blanket. The older girl, already lost in sleep, didn't notice, but her breathing shifted, sinking slowly with the rhythm of the hand against her arm. Sleep here was not silent. It was a conversation of warmth passed between bodies, of comfort shared in contact. Outside, the forest was frozen, not just in temperature, but in time. Even the owls had gone still. The trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with snow, their roots quiet in the earth. And yet, nothing felt dead. Everything simply waited. Inside the longhouse, a Viking man stirred just enough to scratch his beard, then settled again. He had spent the day repairing a broken sled, his hands raw and cold by sunset. Now they rested against his chest, open and empty. In his dream, the sled glided perfectly across smooth ice, no resistance, no weight. There were no clocks to mark these hours, no candles burning low. Only breath and darkness, and the understanding that this was a sacred time, a moment when the Viking body surrendered to the deepest sleep known to their world. Here, sleep was not the end of the day. It was the continuation of life. Somewhere above the village, the clouds parted for just a moment. A single star blinked through, clear and sharp, before fading again behind the mist. It didn't matter. No one in the longhouse saw it. They were too far gone to sleep, not as escape, but as return. A Viking man lay on his back near the outer wall, hands resting on his chest, fingers loosely clasped. His face looked softer in sleep, the worry lines between his brow fading in the dark. He had lost a cousin the year before, buried just beyond the tree line. Most days, he spoke little of it. But tonight, in his dreams, they were together again, sitting on a rock near the stream, laughing, throwing stones into the water. It wasn't sadness, just presence. A kind of visit the waking world could never give. His Viking wife slept beside him, her feet touching his. That was enough. They hadn't exchanged words since dinner time, not from anger, but because none had been needed. Everything had already been said, or simply understood. In sleep, she dreamed of spring of berries staining her hands, of warm sun on her shoulders, of the sound of bees near the edge of the forest. The longhouse was completely dark now, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full of breath, of weight, of shared stillness. The kind of fullness that came from bodies lying close, wrapped in furs and silence, hearts beating at slightly different rhythms that somehow became one. One of the Viking children muttered something in his sleep, a half-formed word in a language older than he knew. His sister beside him turned and placed a hand on his cheek. She didn't wake. The gesture was automatic, learned in the bones. He calmed instantly, his small chest rising and falling in time with hers. The wind had paused completely. Not a single branch moved outside. The snow that had been falling for hours now lay heavy and untouched. The trees stood like guards, ancient and unmoving, their limbs raised toward a sky that had forgotten how to speak. The Viking dog near the door let out a quiet huff, its nose twitching as it chased something in its dream. A rabbit, perhaps, or a scent on the wind. It didn't stir. Its tail gave a single soft thump, then went still. In the silence, the longhouse itself seemed to breathe. The walls, thick with time and smoke, had witnessed hundreds of nights like this, full of dreams, of love not spoken, of peace not asked for. There were no stories told tonight, no songs sung, but somehow everything still spoke. And so the night continued, not racing toward morning, but resting exactly where it was, in the warm dark, in the breath of a dozen Viking souls lying close, in a silence so deep it echoed. Here, the people from Viking times had the deepest sleep, warm, unspoken, and shared. Here, no one needed to awake, not yet. The Viking village outside had vanished beneath a blanket of white. Every rooftop, every fence post, every tree limb was buried under the soft weight of winter. No footsteps broke the surface. No bird called. The world had fallen into a silence so complete it felt like the beginning of time. Inside the Viking longhouse, the quiet was just as thick. Not a single voice, not even a whisper, only the sound of breath. The slow shifting of blankets. The faint creak of wood as bodies moved deeper into warmth. A Viking girl lay curled near the center of the room, her head resting on her mother's thigh. Her hand clutched a small wooden figure of a horse, carved from pine, smoothed by years of use. Her brother had given it to her that morning. She had carried it with her all day, and now it stayed tucked into her palm even in sleep. Her mother didn't move, but her hand rested gently on the girl's shoulder. She was dreaming of running barefoot through grass, the sun high, her hair flying behind her. In the dream, she was younger, stronger. But it wasn't sadness that filled her. It was something simpler. The memory of being free. A Viking boy nearby had turned onto his stomach, his cheek pressed into the furs. His legs were uncovered, but the cold never reached him. The heat of the room, held in by thick walls, and the shared warmth of so many sleepers was enough. He sighed, the sound brief and full of contentment. Above them, the rafters stretched into darkness, their carved edges invisible now. But the symbols were still there, spirals, stars, runes passed down from one hand to another. They didn't shine, but they didn't need to. They lived in the air, in the wood, in the bones of everyone who slept beneath them. A woman coughed once, quietly. A man turned in response and touched her arm, barely waking. Their eyes didn't open. There was no need. The contact was enough. She settled, and he drifted back under. The fire had long since faded, but the heat in the stones remained. Even in sleep, the house held its promise. No cold would reach them. No hunger would stir. No danger would enter. This was the deepest sleep in their Viking blood, had always known warm, guarded, and full of peace. A raven rustled its feathers outside, perched somewhere in the trees, but it didn't call. It too seemed to understand that this was not the time for sound. Inside, nothing broke, nothing snapped or startled. Everything softened. The firs, the breath, the dreams, the old and the young, side by side. Generations tucked beneath a roof that remembered them all. And in the deepest part of the night, when even the snow had stopped falling, they slept on untouched, unhurried, unafraid. The stillness of the night had taken on weight, not heavy, not pressing, but full. It wrapped around every body, every breath, every shadow, outside. The snow had stopped completely. The trees stood unmoving, as if listening. Not even the wind dared to speak. Inside the Viking longhouse, the quiet remained unbroken. The fire pit had cooled to grey ash. The only warmth left came from the closeness of bodies and the memory of flames stored in stone. But it was enough. No one stirred. No one reached for more. A Viking boy near the hearth had rolled onto his side, his hands tucked under his chin. His face was peaceful, lips slightly parted, a thin line of breath rising and falling in time. He dreamed of standing on a cliff above the sea, arms stretched wide, the wind rushing against his chest. There was no fear in the dream, just space, just air, just freedom. His mother lay behind him, curled close, one arm draped over his side. She didn't dream. Not every night needed visions. Some nights gave only rest, the kind of rest the Vikings believed in, where silence itself had meaning, and that too was sacred. Two Viking sisters slept near the back wall, heads resting on a shared bundle of straw. One had kicked her furs off, and the other had gently pulled them back over, still half asleep. Neither remembered the gesture, but their bodies did. The closeness, the habit of care, lived in their bones. From the rafters above, a single droplet of melted snow slipped through a crack in the wood and landed with a soft tap in a clay bowl. No one heard it. It was the kind of sound that only walls remembered, a sound that might echo days later in someone's dream. A man shifted his leg, letting it fall against his wife's calf. Their skin met, and she moved slightly, but didn't wake. Their sleep was like stone, laid beside stone solid, unmoving, shaped over years. The dog near the door lifted its head once, sniffed the air, then rested again. Its ears twitched once at a distant owl call, but the tone was calm, the night was safe. Even the tools leaned quietly against the walls, axes wrapped in leather, baskets full of dried herbs, a stack of folded cloth. There was no tension in the room, nothing waited to be done. Every task had been put to rest, along with the people who completed them. In this hour, time didn't tick forward, it hovered. It swayed slightly like smoke, barely moving, refusing to push them toward dawn. And in that suspended moment, every heart in the Viking household beat in a rhythm so slow it felt eternal. The night held its breath with them, not rushing, no warning, just watching. Here, in the deepest quiet, They remained not lost, not hidden, but fully present, fully still, fully home. The kind of stillness that came only from the deepest Viking sleep, where even dreams slowed to a whisper. The deepest part of the night had arrived at the hour where the stars, though unseen behind clouds, shone the brightest. No creatures stirred outside, not even the branches moved. The forest held its stillness like a long, patient breath. Inside the Viking longhouse, nothing broke the silence. It was not an empty quiet, but a full one, a room packed with sleeping bodies, warm air, and dreams thick as wool. Every chest rose and fell, some slowly, some shallow, but all steady. The sound of breath was a soft rhythm, like waves brushing the shore. An old Viking man stirred slightly. His shoulder ached from an injury years ago, the kind that never truly healed, but sleep had dulled the pain. In his dream, he stood again atop a cliff, younger, stronger, with the wind rushing over his shoulders and the sea stretching out forever. His feet felt sure, his eyes clear. He smiled, though no one could see it. His Viking daughter lay near the center of the room, her infant pressed tightly to her chest. The child barely moved, his lips parting now and then with a quiet gasp of air. She had worried earlier that evening whether he'd be too cold in the night, but now she was sure. His body radiated heat, small but full, his skin soft as down pressed against her heart. The dog by the doorway lifted its head for the last time. It blinked slowly, licked its paw, and lowered itself again into a tight curl. It had watched over them for hours. Now it too rested. Nothing more was needed of it tonight. Above, the rafters faded into black. Even the carvings once proud symbols of gods and beasts disappeared into shadow. But their presence remained. Their energy hung in the room like scent, like breath, like memory. A Viking girl murmured something unintelligible in her sleep. Her brother turned toward her without waking, his hand brushing against hers. Their fingers touched just long enough for something to settle. No one saw it. No one needed to. The room seemed to hum now, not with noise, but with presence, with peace. The Viking longhouse had accepted the night completely, and in return it had been left untouched. No dreams were interrupted, no fear entered. The world outside could do what it pleased. Inside, they were together, safe, wrapped in furs, in silence, in the long thread of their own blood. And the stars, somewhere beyond cloud and smoke, remained above them, patient, constant, watching. But even they could not match the stillness here. Sleep had not merely visited, it had claimed the Viking home as a sacred right. It had rooted itself in the beams, in the straw, in the bones. They did not sleep like the world would end. They slept like it already had, and all that remained was peace. A faint glow returned to the edge of the sky. Not enough to see, not yet, but just enough for the trees to sense that something had changed. The night was not over. It still held its grip, but the world had begun to tilt gently toward morning. Inside the longhouse, no one stirred. The warmth from bodies and blankets had not faded. It had grown deeper, settled. There was no rush to rise, no need. The house understood that dawn came slowly here, and it waited with the same patience it had shown for generations. A Viking woman rolled onto her back, her arm falling across her husband's chest. Her palm landed lightly against his ribs. He didn't move, but his breath deepened, as if his body recognized the touch even in sleep. He dreamed of nothing in particular, just the shape of his father's face, the sound of wind in tall grass, the feel of water cupped in his hand. Their Viking daughter lay at their feet, turned onto her side, face buried in a soft fur. Her small fingers twitched now and then, her breath shallow and steady. She didn't dream of gods or stories. She dreamed of her mother's arms. That was enough. In the far corner, an elderly Viking man blinked awake, but only for a moment. He didn't move. His eyes opened just wide enough to see the rafters above him, and in that blackness, he felt comfort. He had survived many winters. This one, too, was passing without pain. That was all he needed to know. He closed his eyes again. A pot near the hearth shifted as the floor creaked faintly beneath it. The sound was soft, too soft to wake anyone, but it was real. The house was still alive, still listening, still holding the night in its chest like one final, slow inhale. The dog near the door sighed. It had long given up its watch. Its legs stretched briefly, claws dragging lightly against the wooden floor, before curling once again into the warmest spot. Every corner of the room, every shape under the blankets, every strand of hair and hand and shadow, it all felt connected. There were no individual moments, only one long breath, one shared silence, one Viking sleep. Above them, the sky lightened by a hair's width, the kind of light that wasn't seen, only felt. It touched the outer edge of the world and whispered of return, but it did not rush. Inside the longhouse, sleep still ruled. The past, the future both paused, and in that pause, the people stayed, still, warm, dreaming. The stars were gone now, the fire was ash, the stories were quiet. But the peace remained. Somewhere beyond the hills, the sky had begun to turn from black to blue. Not the blue of daylight, but the kind that comes just before it cold, soft, barely there. A few birds rustled in the trees but did not sing. The world was preparing, slowly, gently. There was no hurry. Inside the Viking longhouse, the first touches of pale light slipped through the cracks in the wood. It didn't wake anyone, it only layered itself on top of the shadows, a quiet guest entering the room. The air was still warm from the bodies curled beneath blankets. Breath lingered in the space like smoke, rising, mixing, disappearing. A Viking man stretched in his sleep, his face turning slightly toward the wall. He had dreamt of fishing a boat rocking on calm waters, his hands pulling in a net heavy with silver. He smiled, just faintly, as if the net were still in his grip. His Viking wife lay beside him, already beginning to wake. Her mind hovered in the space between dream and memory. She did not open her eyes. She listened first to the slow breath of her Viking children, the soft creak of the roof, the distant stirring of the dog. All was well. Her body remained still. There was no need to rise yet. The children remained in deep Viking sleep. One boy snored quietly. His sister had pressed her foot against his leg, anchoring herself in the closeness. Even in dreams, they knew how to stay near. A soft beam of light passed over a clay bowl, resting near the hearth. Inside were dried flowers, 2 black stones, and a tuft of wool, a small bundle left the evening before by a young Viking girl who hadn't known why, only that it felt right. The objects glowed faintly in the new light, like offerings being accepted by the house itself. The dog at the door raised its head. Its ears perked, its eyes squinted into the grey dawn. Then it lowered its head again. There was no need to bark. No stranger approached. The village slept on. A baby murmured. Her Viking mother lifted her gently against her chest, without thinking. The child settled with a small sigh. No crying, no fuss, just movement, breath, and return. Outside, the frost began to melt along the trees, one drop at a time. Inside, sleep still held its place, not tight now, but loose, like a hand that has done its work and is beginning to let go. The house, the people, the night, all were coming to the edge of something new. But not yet. One more breath, one more moment. The sky beyond the longhouse had begun to glow, faint, pale, soft light that had not yet found its strength. It touched the tops of trees, turned frost into glimmer, and outlined the shape of the world once more. Morning was near, but not quite here. Inside, breath still filled the room, not rushed, not broken, just steady, peaceful, the kind of breath that belonged to Viking families who had mastered the art of the deepest sleep in history. The fire was gone, the house was quiet, but nothing felt empty. Everything felt full. A Viking mother opened her eyes, not wide, not sharply, just enough to see the top of her Viking child's head, nestled beneath her chin. She smiled, her lips barely moving. Her arm tightened slightly, as if to remind her daughter she was still there. The child didn't stir. Her breathing continued, soft and shallow. The sky beyond the longhouse had begun to glow. Faint, pale, soft light that had not yet found its strength. It touched the tops of trees, turned frost into glimmer, and outlined the shape of the world once more. Morning was near, but not quite here. Inside, breath still filled the room. Not rushed, not broken, just steady, peaceful. The kind of breath that belonged to Vikings who had given themselves fully to the night. The fire was gone. The house was quiet, but nothing felt empty. Everything felt full. A Viking mother opened her eyes. Not wide, not sharply, just enough to see the top of her child's head, nestled beneath her chin. She smiled, her lips barely moving. Her arm tightened slightly, as if to remind her daughter she was still there. The child didn't stir. Her breathing continued, soft and shallow. Across the room, a Viking man blinked slowly into the dim light. His back ached, but not painfully. It was the ache of work well done, of a body used fully, of life lived in rhythm with the land. He reached for the fur beside him and pulled it up to his shoulders before closing his eyes again. He didn't need to rise yet. The morning would wait. The rest of the Viking family slept on. Their dreams had grown quieter. The movements are smaller. Some bodies had shifted toward one another during the night, seeking warmth in sleep. Others had stretched out, trusting the security of the space around them. Above, the carved beams caught the faintest touch of dawn. The runes and symbols etched into their surface seemed to hum with life, not magic, but memory. This Viking home had seen 1,000 nights like this one, 1,000 mornings like the one to come, and it had kept them all. The dog at the entrance stood now, slowly, stretching one leg at a time. It yawned, shook out its fur, and looked toward the door. It didn't whine, it didn't bark. It simply watched as the first lines of light crept into the space, filling the longhouse like water from a rising stream. Someone murmured. A hand touched a shoulder. The fur slipped off and was gently pulled back. No words yet, just motion, just presence. The longhouse did not wake with noise. The kind of knowing that lives in the chest. That morning had come. That sleep had done its work, the kind of deep, healing sleep only Viking nights could bring. And that, for one more night, they had been together. Safe, warm, whole. They had given themselves to the dark, and the dark had given them back.